I'm tempted to say, here we go again. The House is once more dealing with legislation to patch up the grain handling and transportation system in Western Canada. Just about a year ago, we were doing exactly the same thing. Back then, it was called Bill C-52, legislation to create service-level agreements between shippers and railways. Just about everybody told the government at that time that Bill C-52, as originally presented, would not work. But the Conservatives refused to listen to any of that advice. They refused each and every amendment. They voted them down. They told farmers and others basically to get stuffed. They put on the whips and they voted against every single idea that was presented to the Standing Committee to try and make Bill C-52 useful. They forced it through with absolutely no change. And sure enough, as everybody predicted at the time, it failed. Not a single service-level agreement was ever completed under the useless Bill C-52. And that is one of the reasons why the grains industry is now in such chaos. Grain shipments are months and months and millions of tons behind. Piles of crop are stranded on farms across the prairies. Some is now spoiling. Feed users and domestic processors can't get the supplies they need. Terminals are half empty. Ships are waiting. Demurrage charges are horrendous. Many sales have been outright lost. Others have been deferred. And the prairie price is now down by 35 or 40% compared to where it was last year. Good customers, like the Japanese, are simply going elsewhere to buy the grain that they would normally come to Canada to get. World grain conferences are talking incessantly about, quote, the unreliable Canadian grain system. Some farmers have not had any income since last year. They're rolling last year's debt into next year's debt. And add all that together, and by the government's own calculation, as specified in their March 7th order in council, the impact of this disaster is now in the range of some $8 billion in costs and losses. $8 billion scooped out of the prairie farm economy, most of that taken directly from the pockets of farmers. The problem has been dragging on for very nearly 6 months now, and the best the government can forecast is that it will take another 6 months, another 6 long, painful months to clear the backlog that now exists. Grain companies are going to have a banner year. The deductions that they are taking off farmers' checks have never been higher. Railways are going to have a banner year. In fact, they have gone to New York and boasted to their shareholders that this year's grain problem is just a, quote, modest little thing. And don't worry, they say to their shareholders, grain shippers are captive shippers anyway. There is no other way to move the product. There are no serious financial penalties for not moving it, so eventually the railways will get paid in full. The only one here who is out of pocket for that $8 billion is the farmer. So crisis legislation is obviously necessary. Indeed, it's long overdue. So how did this mess arise? Well, everyone blames everyone else, and they blame the weather, and they blame a big crop that came from the bumper harvest last year. It's always somebody else's fault, and no one is responsible, and no one is accountable for the failure and for the damages. But think of the painfully damaging message that sends to prairie farmers. Of all of the participants in the grain system, farmers are the ones who did their jobs very well last year. They produced maybe the best crop in history. And now the system is saying to them, don't you dare do that again, because all the rest of us in the system can't handle anything more than just an average crop. Neither do we have the will to give grain any sense of priority. So you, the farmer, you just be content with mediocrity. That's what the system is saying to farmers by this massive failure this past year. Well, That's simply not good enough. The system failed farmers this past year. It failed badly. And there's responsibility all around for the railways, for the grain companies, maybe even a little bit for the cold winter. But if the system failed, then this is the question that must be asked. Who designed the system? Who put it in place? Who set it up for failure? Who has imposed $8 billion in costs and losses on prairie farmers? And the unequivocal answer to that question is this government of Canada. This disastrous system, the one that has failed so badly, is the one that was designed and implemented over the past 3 years by this government. And that is where the buck has to stop. So we're faced with Bill C-30. I think one thing in the bill that almost everybody, except the railways, would applaud is the change with respect to interswitching. That will possibly simulate competition at a great many more delivery points across the prairies. And that would be a good thing. I note that some of the farm organizations are welcoming this move. They're also describing it as a modest improvement, but it is an improvement. And we all hope that it will work. The legislation also re-legislates that order in council from March the 7th, the one that ordered the railways to move a certain volume of grain in a certain time frame. But significantly, the legislation does not improve upon the order that was made on the 7th of March. The railways will not be asked to do significantly better than they would otherwise have done anyway with the onset of spring. So the question is, why not? And that's the question that's being asked so eloquently by the Minister of Agriculture in the province of Saskatchewan. And this is a very practical, business-like, down-to-earth minister. He is a no-nonsense kind of guy. And he would not propose a volume or a penalty system that was outlandish or outrageous or impossible to achieve. The province of Saskatchewan, through the minister, has asked for about an 18% increase in the volumes to be shipped and penalties to be at the rate of $250,000 a day instead of $100,000 a day. He's looked at it, he's examined it carefully as someone who knows the system, and he is saying, why not? That would help too if the government can have a positive answer to Minister Stewart. The rest of C-30 is largely enabling legislation to authorize the creation of future regulations. There is no immediate action. It is simply future hypotheticals if regulations are ultimately forthcoming. So you ask the question, why are there no legislative guarantees for farmers? A regulation can be changed by the stroke of a pen in the middle of the night. And right now, no one knows what those regulations might say. It would be very helpful if the government would table the draft regulations before the Standing Committee, so the Standing Committee would know what those regulations are likely to do when they finally come in. For example, will there be comprehensive monitoring from one end of the system to the other to measure, analyze, and report publicly on grain marketing, transportation, and handling, and the outcomes that the system is actually generating? Will there be complete transparency? Will there be regulation on the basis calculations and the deductions that come off farmers' grain checks and go into the pockets of grain companies? That basis spread today has never been wider in Canadian history, meaning the grain companies are getting a lot of money and the farmers are getting less. Will there be any sensible business-like coordination of grain handling and transportation logistics to replace the absolutely chaotic free-for-all that exists today? No one is out there directing traffic, so you've got a snarled mess. What about short lines? What about producer cars? These were the issues raised by the Parliamentary Secretary for the Minister of Foreign Affairs. What about servicing domestic customers, like the feed grain users in the Fraser Valley and the cereal manufacturers in Eastern Canada? Will there be a full costing review to track all revenues and costs, to follow the money in the grain system, to see how the efficiency gains have been shared or not shared over the past 22 years when there was the last costing review? Will there be any new capacity or surge capacity? In those service level agreements, will there be any precise definition about what service the railways must provide? How will performance be measured? And will farmers get liquidated damages when the system fails? Penalties paid to the government don't help farmers. The damages need to be paid to the farmers who've incurred the losses. And why, Mr. Speaker, has all of this been left out of C-30? It's been left to be done by regulation, maybe sometime. Why were these specific amendments voted down when they were last considered by the government a year ago in the context of Bill C-52? And when will farmers get to see any of those proposed draft regulations? I think it would be very wise for the government to make sure that farmers and all of us have a chance to review those regulations before the Standing Committee is called upon to vote on Bill C-30. Mr. Speaker, and finally, will this government accept common sense amendments to try to fix the mess in grain handling and transportation in the interests of farmers who, I repeat, are the ones and the only ones who are picking up the tab for all of this disaster? Concerns about the inadequacy of Bill C-30 have obviously been expressed by many members of Parliament on all three sides of this House, and concern is coming from others as well. I mentioned the Minister of Agriculture in the province of Saskatchewan. The Saskatchewan Association of Rural Municipalities has expressed concern, the Saskatchewan Canola Growers Association, and of course the Parliamentary Secretary. As this bill goes speedily through second reading today, which I think it should, and into the Standing Committee on Agriculture and Agri-Food for detailed consideration, the government needs to ensure that all of those who have these concerns, all of those who are going to be vitally affected, for better or for worse, by the outcome of Bill C-30, have the opportunity to be heard. There are only about 4 meetings of the committee normally scheduled between now and when the House would adjourn at Easter. This matter has to be resolved before the Easter break. I think it would be very important for us to hear from all parties today saying explicitly that whatever extra hours or extra meetings of the Agriculture Committee may be required to make sure that all the witnesses are heard, that those meetings and hours will be added to the committee's agenda so that we can have a full ventilation of this subject. No one will feel that they've been shut down or cut off, and that we can all be assured that when the final decisions are taken, the full information was before the committee and the decision is taken with full knowledge of what, in fact, the circumstances are. For part of the Liberal Party, we are more than happy to have as many meetings as it takes to make sure that everybody gets heard. I think that's what I heard from the Deputy Agriculture Critic for the NDP, and I hope the government would give us that assurance before the end of the afternoon so that we can all make sure that the Agriculture Committee does its job properly. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.